All right, so today we're going to tackle something that I think a lot of English learners find tricky.
Yeah.
It's modal verbs.
They can be tough.
Yeah, these little words can really trip you up
Yeah.
because they seem simple enough, but then when you really start to look at them, you realize that
Right.
there are all these subtle shades of meaning.
Absolutely.
So we're going to try to demystify
Yeah.
3 of the most common and I think the trickiest ones.
Okay.
Must, have to, and should.
Yeah, I think those are the big 3 that people struggle with.
They are. And, even as someone who's been speaking English my whole life, I still sometimes find myself second-guessing which one to use in certain situations. And we've got some really interesting insights from our research on this that I think will help to shed some light on these tricky verbs.
Awesome.
So let's just dive right in. Let's start with must and have to.
Okay.
Because these 2 are often used interchangeably.
Yes.
But there is a subtle difference.
Yeah, there's a really important distinction between the 2.
Yeah. And what is that distinction?
Well, I always think of must as being like an internal obligation.
Okay.
It's like something that you feel you really need to do.
So it's coming from within.
It's coming from within.
Whereas have to.
Yeah, have to is more external.
Right.
It's like something that's imposed on you by circumstances or by somebody else.
So like a rule or a law.
Exactly, or like a deadline.
Okay.
So for example, you might say, I must finish this project tonight if it's something that's really important to you personally. But you would say, I have to finish this report by tomorrow if it's something that your boss has asked you to do.
Yeah, I see. So it's
So one is internal, one is external.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think that's why have to is much more common in spoken English.
Yeah, I was going to say that, have to feels a lot more.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's more informal.
Yeah.
Whereas must can sound a bit formal or even a bit
Yeah, it can sound
strong.
Yeah, almost a little bit bossy.
Yeah, a little bit bossy, yeah.
Like you're giving an order.
Yeah.
But then there are situations where must is the appropriate choice, like in those, official rules and regulations.
Exactly. Like if you see a sign that says passengers must wear seatbelts, that's not really a suggestion.
Yeah, it's definitely not a suggestion.
It's an obligation.
Yeah.
So must is used to emphasize that it's a requirement.
It's serious business.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got must coming from within, have to being external pressure, and then must being used in those formal situations where it's like, you got to do this.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've covered the basics of must and have to. But what happens when we throw in the negative forms of these verbs?
Oh, things get even more.
I bet it does.
Complicated?
Because English loves to be complicated.
It does.
So we've got mustn't, and then we've got don't have to.
All right, so those are the 2 that we're going to untangle now.
Yes, okay.
Help us untangle these.
Okay, so think of mustn't as like a big red stop sign.
Oh.
It means something is forbidden.
Okay.
It's prohibited.
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot do it.
So mustn't is serious.
It's serious, like you mustn't cross the street when the light is red.
Yeah, you could get hit by a car.
Exactly. It's dangerous.
Yes, don't do it.
Don't do it.
All right, mustn't. Very serious.
Okay.
Now what about don't have to?
Okay, so don't have to is like a big sigh of relief.
Oh, okay.
It means you're off the hook.
Okay.
You don't have any obligation.
So it's optional.
It's optional. You have a choice.
Okay.
So, for example, somebody might say, you don't have to come to the party if you don't want to.
Yeah.
It's totally up to you.
Okay, so it's like a free pass.
It's a free pass.
Yeah.
You have the freedom to choose.
I like don't have to.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
So with mustn't and don't have to, the difference is really clear. Yeah, those are 2 very distinct meanings.
Yeah, one is forbidden. Yeah. The other one is optional.
Okay, that's a good way to remember it.
All right, good.
So we've got forbidden and optional.
Yes.
But here's another little twist.
Okay, I like twists.
Me too.
What is that?
Even though mustn't is grammatically correct.
Yeah.
And it's, the more formal way to express prohibition. In spoken English, you're more likely to hear can't.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, you mustn't touch the paintings, someone might say, you can't touch the paintings.
Right. It's less formal.
Yeah.
But it still gets the point across.
Yeah, it still means don't do it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind when you're speaking English. All right, so we've covered must, have to, mustn't, don't have to. Are you ready to move on to should?
I think so. Should. I think we're ready for should.
All right, let's tackle should.
Yeah. Should is definitely more like a gentle suggestion. It's like you're offering advice or an opinion.
Right, so it's not as strong as like must or have to.
Exactly. It doesn't carry that same sense of obligation.
Okay, so for example, you could say, you should try this new restaurant. It's really good.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're not saying they have to go.
Right. You're just making a recommendation.
Right.
And they're free to ignore it if they want.
Okay. But should can also be used to express like what we think is the right thing to do.
Yes, it can be a way of expressing a moral obligation.
Right, even if it's not like a rule.
Right, exactly.
So you might say something like, you should apologize to her. You know, you hurt her feelings.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But you're not saying they must apologize.
Right. It's more like you're appealing to their sense of right and wrong.
Right, you're giving them the option to do the right thing.
Exactly.
Now, this is making me think about how we were talking about must and have to being used for advice.
Yeah.
But they felt much stronger than should.
Right.
Is there a difference in how they're used in that context?
Yes. Definitely must and have to, when used for advice, convey a much stronger sense of urgency or importance.
Okay, so it's like you really, really want them to take your advice.
Yeah, it's like you're saying, this is really important, you need to listen to me.
Right, so like if you said, you must see this movie, it's amazing.
Right.
That's a lot different than just saying like, oh, you should check out this movie.
Exactly. It's like you're putting your foot down.
Yeah, you're emphasizing the importance of the advice.
Yes.
Okay, so it's like should is a gentle nudge. Must or have to is like
a strong recommendation.
Yeah, you're not messing around.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Good bit.
Now, what about negative advice?
Okay.
How do we express that using these modal verbs?
Well, for negative advice, shouldn't is the way to go.
Okay.
It's the most common and natural way to advise someone against doing something.
So, for example, you could say, you shouldn't eat that whole cake by yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
But you wouldn't say, you mustn't eat that whole cake.
No, mustn't is too strong for that.
Okay.
It sounds more like a prohibition.
Yeah.
And don't have to doesn't really work either because it implies that there's no obligation.
Right. And in this case, there kind of is.
Yeah, you're trying to steer them away from a bad decision.
Right. So shouldn't is the perfect balance of advice and caution.
Right.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Good.
Now, we've talked about how these modal verbs are used for obligation and advice, but they can also be used to express probability and certainty.
Yeah, that's another really interesting use of these verbs.
Yeah, so you might hear someone say, it must be raining outside.
Right.
Or he should be arriving soon.
Exactly.
So how do these verbs work in that context?
Well, when we use must to express probability, it means we're pretty certain that something is true.
Okay, so it's like a strong assumption based on...
Yeah, based on evidence or logic.
Okay.
So if you see someone come in with a dripping wet umbrella, you could say, it must be raining outside.
Because why else would they have a wet umbrella?
Exactly.
Right.
Now, have to can also express probability, but it often suggests a slightly weaker level of certainty.
Okay, so it's like you're pretty sure, but you're not 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I hear thunder in the distance, I might say, it has to rain soon.
Right.
But I'm not guaranteeing that it will rain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we have should, which expresses a more moderate level of probability.
Okay.
Often based on expectations or past experiences.
Right. So if I know my friend is always on time, I might say, he should be here any minute now.
Right.
Because that's what usually happens.
Exactly. You're basing your prediction on past experience.
Okay, so we've got must for strong probability, has to for slightly weaker probability, and should for like a moderate level of probability.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all starting to make a lot more sense now.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm really starting to see how these modal verbs can add so much nuance to our language.
Yeah, they're really powerful little words.
They are, but I have to ask, are there any common pitfalls that English learners should watch out for when using these verbs?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some common mistakes that people make. Yeah, one of the biggest ones is using must to talk about past obligations.
Okay.
So we wouldn't say, I must go to the store yesterday.
Right.
We would say, I had to go to the store yesterday.
Okay, so must is really only for present or future obligations.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. Another common mistake is using should for strong obligations or rules.
Okay.
So, for example, if there's a sign that says no smoking,
right,
we wouldn't say you should not smoke here.
Oh, okay.
We would say, you must not smoke here, or you can't smoke here.
Right, because should implies that there's a choice.
Exactly.
And in this case, there is no choice.
Right, it's a rule.
You can't smoke there.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a good distinction to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think those are the two biggest ones that I see.
Okay, so watch out for those.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about these modal verbs.
Good. I'm glad.
And I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to how I use them.
Yeah, I think once you start to become aware of these subtleties,
Right.
you really start to notice them everywhere.
You do, and you realize how much they can really affect the meaning
Exactly.
of what you're saying.
Yeah.
So do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Yeah, I would just say, don't be afraid to experiment
Okay.
with these modal verbs. Make mistakes.
Yeah.
That's how we learn.
That's how we learn.
And the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
That's great advice. I think that's a great note to end on.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep practicing those modal verbs, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of English.